I am Sarah Falvo. I am calling from the Arcview Group. I am the Director of Community here, and we're so glad to have you join us for this special edition of Arcview Access, where we will chat about safe banking, the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act, CAOA, and the MORE Act. Before we kick things off, I would also like to thank our alliance partners, Ice Miller, who will be on the panel today, Green Growth CPAs, Alpha Root, ProClinical, GrowFlow, Work, Dwayne Morris, and Zuber Lawler. We're deeply grateful for the support of these companies, which allows us to put on great programming such as this webinar. Just a reminder that you can find more information about the Arcview Group and our programs on social media and also at arcviewgroup.com. As I mentioned before, this is a special edition of our Arcview Access webinars. There's been a lot of rumblings about whether federal legalization will be the best thing to happen to the industry or the biggest threat. Before federal legalization actually comes to fruition, a lot more must happen to get us on that path. That includes action around safe banking and the CAOA. And today we'll be discussing all of those things, including what is actually safe banking and the possible effects it will have on the industry. Additionally, what is the CAOA and how is it affecting safe banking's chances of making it through the Senate? And most importantly, what does another layer of regulatory framework mean for the cannabis industry? And now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, David Abernathy, who's principal at Arcview Management Consulting, who will be driving this discussion forward. Take it away, David.
Thanks, Sarah. Really excited to be here to talk to you all about some pieces of legislation that some of which have been sort of floating around Washington for quite some time. One of which is relatively new, but all of which would have pretty profound implications for the cannabis industry if they passed. I'm honored to be joined today by Jared Lodeholt and Tim Ndaa, who are partner and principal, respectively, at Ice Miller, as well as Amber Littlejohn, executive director of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, and Chris Lindsay, Director of Government Relations for MPP. I have the good fortune of sitting on the boards of both the Minority Cannabis Business Association and the Marijuana Policy Project, and getting to hear from both Amber and Chris on a regular basis is just an unbelievably valuable opportunity. So I would encourage you to get involved with those and other cannabis advocacy organizations. We really need to keep the ball moving in the right direction. It's pretty clear at this point that federal legalization will happen at some point, but we do have a lot of work to do if we want it to look anything like the industry that I think many of us have imagined for years. So with that, why don't we give some quick intros, starting with Jared and Tim.
Hi, I'm Jared Lodeholt. I'm a partner in Ice Miller's Washington office in our cannabis and public affairs practice.
Good afternoon. Hi, Sarah, and thank you for the opportunity. And David, thank you for hosting today. Tim Ndaa, I'm principal at Ice Miller. I am both in the state government affairs arena as well as the federal government affairs work, and look forward to the conversation today. Thank you.
Excellent. Chris or Amber? Let's go with Amber.
Good afternoon. My name is Amber Littlejohn. I am Executive Director of the Minority Cannabis Business Association. We are the largest national trade association serving minority cannabis businesses and their community. So thank you for Arcview for having me here today.
Thank you.
And I'm Chris Lindsay. I'm the Director of Government Relations at the Marijuana Policy Project and on loan right now at the U.S. Cannabis Council, where I serve in the GR department and do a lot of lobbying and cat herding right now as we get ready in response to the CAO Act and many other things. So thanks very much for having me on.
Excellent. So why don't we start this conversation by just talking a little bit about these pieces of legislation, and we can maybe start with safe banking. Jared, could you tell us what safe banking is?
Certainly. So in its simplest terms, the Safe Banking Act removes existing kind of prohibitions or limitations on financial institutions and their ability to service cannabis companies. So that's credit unions, that's banks, because now, as I'm sure everybody on this call knows, you have a controlled substance that is scheduled in a way that is not legal federally, but our payment system, our banking system is federal. So there are limitations on a bank's ability to do anything. That's banking, checking, standard business, lines of credit, loans, virtually any form of capital access. So that does not mean, and one of the things I do want to clarify, does not mean that a financial institution cannot, under any circumstance, service these businesses. But what we do have is very, very strict guidance and very, very significant limitations on what banking institutions and financial institutions can do to anyone in the supply chain. And what the SAFE Act seeks to do is lower or eliminate those barriers that currently exist.
Indeed, it's a rough situation. Some banks are banking cannabis businesses. The guidance from the federal government right now, from FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, is that if banks are doing business with plant-touching cannabis companies, they have to file what's called an SAR, a suspicious activities report, for every single transaction. This is a huge sort of compliance burden on the banks, which is why many banks, one of the reasons why many banks are not touching cannabis companies, and those that are often charging very high fees to account for the additional risk that they're taking, as well as the additional regulatory load, having to go through all of those filings for each and every transaction. Chris, can you tell us a little bit about the CAOA?
Sure. So this was the big bill we had been waiting for quite a long time. We'd heard that the Senate had been working on its own version, really, of the MORE Act on steroids. So this would be not only the criminal justice pieces, descheduling, which we saw the MORE Act do, and some of the other aspects, but much more treatment when it comes to what does the regulatory structure actually look like. And so that was really the big news, was, okay, what are we going to see, and how do we respond? And so this bill had been long anticipated, finally came around, I think, mid-June, if I remember. I could be easily wrong. The bottom line is it was about 160 pages. It took a long time for the different groups to, I think, digest it. But there was a lot of similarity amongst the different groups once we started to compare notes, I would say. And we'll have a chance, I'm sure, to talk about it. Out of the gate, it really took a large portion of the regulatory framework and handed it to the FDA. I think that caused a lot of groups to start to consider what the implications would be. There were also some shocking numbers when it came to taxes. And there are other features that we can talk more at length about, but it gave a lot of groups pause. And while it certainly did the things that we like to see, like descheduling and expungement, and we want to see those pieces in place, it gave us a lot to think about when it comes to what this emerging landscape may have for us.
Indeed. And I think there's a lot of trepidation about some of the provisions in this bill, as well as some of the things that this bill didn't address. There are a lot of folks who have seen things like what happened in California when adult use passed, along with a new set of medical regulations that really changed the industry. I think that it's very important that happened, that California is now an adult use state. But because of some of the problems with the legislation that came along with it, we ended up with a tax system that is completely out of whack, and regulations that make it very difficult for licensed cannabis businesses to compete with the the unregulated market. So I think there's a lot of fear about that sort of thing playing out at the federal level. And Amber, can you tell us a little bit about MORE, which has been bouncing around for quite some time here and has had changes made to it. It has passed the House, I believe, 5 times at this point, and never made any significant headway in the Senate.
Well, the MORE Act is a historic piece of legislation in that it is a comprehensive cannabis reform, equity-centered cannabis reform that has, as you mentioned, passed the House several times now. The bill itself is the product of national or Washington, D.C. drug policy reform organizations, which is evident in that there is not a focus on, as you have in the CAO, actually creating a regulatory framework for the industry, which was a little bit troubling. And additionally, there were some major gaps in the social equity provisions as it pertained to both community reinvestment and the really supporting minority operators in the cannabis industry. So when it initially passed the House last Congress, there was a provision in there that included the exclusion of people with felonies being able to get permitted to operate in cannabis. So that was taken out in the new Congress's iteration of the bill. But one of the things that came out was the exclusive funding for minority businesses. One of the other challenges, again, to this being the bill that is the product, again, of more drug reform organizations as opposed to criminal justice reform, minority businesses, community leaders all coming together to really encompass the broad scope of what equity really means when it comes to restoring the harms of prohibition. So even the criminal justice reform provisions, as I have spoken to experts in this field, they've kind of raised the alarm about how many people would actually get out of jail due to this legislation. So we love, it is put forth and sponsored by some of the most, diehard champions of cannabis reform. So we always are wanting to support this legislation and see it be better. But as with all of the comprehensive legislation that's been introduced, it definitely needs some work.
Thanks. And so jumping back to safe banking for a second, we have really kind of like a Twilight Zone situation playing out in the legislature at the moment, where safe banking has broad support among House Democrats. It's got support among some House Republicans. It also has some bipartisan support in the Senate, with both Democrats and Republicans supporting the bill, although it also has significant bipartisan opposition in the Senate. Can you guys talk a little bit about that situation, a situation where a bill that enjoyed near universal support from Democrats in the House moves to the Senate, and the biggest obstacle in the Senate seems to be Senate Democratic leadership?
Happy to do so. So the politics, I think, are directly related to the CAOA. And I think the view that, unfortunately, I think there's some, namely Senator Booker and I think Senator Schumer and Senator Wyden, I think, as well, they believe that if banking moves, if the SAFE Act is somehow passed as a standalone or passed as an amendment to the Defense Authorization Act, then that will somehow cause us to lose momentum for the broader comprehensive reform effort. And therefore, until we get movement on the broader issue, we can't deal with the narrower banking issue, right? I think that is what animates the politics, even if there are public statements that may suggest otherwise. But I think for many of us on the call and who do this work every day, I think we can generally agree that the concern is that this shouldn't just be about banking. We should legalize it. We should create our regulatory framework, so forth and so on. I think everybody on this call agrees that we should do those things. But ultimately, what happens in Congress is a matter of math, right? And the votes simply aren't there this Congress for the comprehensive reform that I think many folks, probably want to see. But what we do know is there are always votes for the NDAA, which is the Defense Authorization Act. And one of the recent developments was the most recent iteration, I think, out of the House was connecting the SAFE Act to the NDAA, which is must-pass legislation, which then opens up the industry to being treated like every other regulated industry in America, at least with respect to financial services. I think I disagree. I disagree, I think, strongly, quite frankly, with Senators Booker, Wyden, and Schumer in that I don't think we lose anything by virtue of supporting banking and just mainstreaming this industry for financial services industries. Furthermore, the folks who are going to be the hardest hit are going to be your smallest entrepreneurs in the cannabis space when they can't access some of these, again, basic business checking, credit, lines of credit, the basics that I think we've all come to expect when you open a business. So I think I see a question: will the Senate attach SAFE to the NDAA? We don't know, right? I think that's the fight. The fight now is, will our Senate Democratic leadership allow it to be attached and pass the same version of the NDAA that passed the House? That is the question. And I think our answer is hopefully yes. I think that is our work, I think, is the folks on this call, but also across our networks, is to make sure that actually becomes reality. So the politics, I think, involved this broader comprehensive bill, which I think we can all agree doesn't have the votes. And quite frankly, it's just a discussion draft. So it's not even a bill. To clarify, CAOA still has not gone through regular order. There have not been hearings. We are far, far away from an actual bill. And it's not even clear what the timeline is on moving from discussion draft to bill. But we have a vetted proposal that has passed the House multiple times and that now has been attached to the NDAA that we hope will pass, if we can get the opposition from our Democratic majority leader and Senators Booker and Wyden to agree to that. And I think that is really, I think we're 3 senators away from making this a reality. They just happen to be, one of them just happens to be your majority leader, which is a challenge, but one that I think is surmountable.
It's really painful to watch, because the narrative that makes this politically viable, is that this would just, safe banking would be just this boon for big cannabis. And, we don't want to give something to big cannabis when we could give something to the little guy. The reality is that big cannabis companies aren't hurting for funding. Big cannabis companies don't have money, don't have to worry about insurance. Many of them self-insure or have access to other insurance products. And SAFE also includes the same provisions for insurance companies. And so, it's painful as we're watching states like Senator Booker's own state, like New Jersey, coming online. They're going to launch their application process, and people are scrambling. So we are going to watch yet another social equity program fold under the struggle to get capital, just because it's not there. Will it fix everything? Will it fix racism in lending? No, but we can make sure that there is oversight, and there is oversight actually in the bill to really track how money is going out. But if we take it from 5 to 7, that's still an increase. And right now what we have is very little to nothing. And as David mentioned, even just banking is expensive. Having a bank account, processing payments is also expensive.
Absolutely. And there's a big safety issue here as well. There are quite a few security firms that specialize in security for cannabis companies. And some of that security is just because cannabis is a high value crop. But a lot of that security, most of the security, is because a huge number of cannabis companies are doing business in cash, which, aside from making compliance very difficult, making accounting very difficult, and making just general business operations difficult and expensive, means that there are large stockpiles of cash lying around at these businesses. Some of these security companies are comprised of folks who were special operators in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they treat a cash run in Denver like a VIP run in Fallujah. They're using low-profile armored vehicles. They are changing vehicles on a regular basis. They are dropping cash at safe houses. It really is an absurd thing for us to have to deal with in this time, and it creates a big target for criminals, particularly violent criminals, who might want to try to get a big payday by taking some of that cash that's lying around. So Booker, Schumer, and Wyden have been positioning safe banking as sort of a boon to the banks, right? And this is sort of feeding into this this resentment of the banking sector among Americans. Those of us in the cannabis industry, by and large, don't view this as something that's really a great boon to the banks. It's a boon to anyone who has to do business in the cannabis industry. It does make it easier for the banks, and I'm sure that banks will find new and interesting ways to make money in the cannabis industry if safe banking passes. But I think that it's a little bit disingenuous to position this that way when, as Amber mentioned, minority cannabis businesses are some of the hardest hit by the lack of access to banking. Any thoughts on that sort of positioning and why there's this disconnect?
Yeah, I mean, I think the positioning stems from a need to explain a very odd public position. And I think that then leads to tried and true talking points about big bad banks, which couldn't be farther from the reality, because if you look at who does do bad, because again, there are institutions who do them. Obviously, there are lots of there's the SARS filings and all the other heightened oversight, but you have financial institutions in the space, and the large banks aren't the ones doing it. By and large, they don't touch this space. So what you have are community and regional banks who've decided they're going to do and invest in their compliance infrastructure to bank the product, and they charge their customers the fees to do so that it takes to hire the FTEs. So I think what you have are talking points that really, I think, it's a sleight of hand when the real politics are, we have written a comprehensive bill and we want all of the conversations about cannabis to be about our bill and not about this narrow bill that A, we did not write, and B, does not get to these broader issues of legalization and justice work, which again, everyone on this call, I think, agrees with. But again, you take what you can, especially in a 50-50 Senate. And what we've not talked about is it's also not clear whether the president would even sign the bill if he got it. Because we've not talked about the president's position on cannabis as well, because I think there's an assumption that if it got to his desk, he'd sign it. And I actually don't think that that's the safest assumption to make. But I do think if the NDAA got to his desk with SAFE attached to it, he'd docu-sign it if he could, right? So, again, I think what you have are very weird politics that I think stem from what they are aware is a really strange position, but talking points that I think people won't question, especially on the left, which is, the banks aren't doing right, which, again, I mean, there's a long history of banks not doing right by communities of color in particular. But again, that's misdirection. And I think, again, we'd all like a broader bill, but there's a political reality that we have to fend with that I think it may frustrate many advocates and folks in the industry and consumers, but ultimately the votes simply are not there. And so I think we have to operate in a 60-vote world, which is the world that we're in. And we don't even have, if I don't think you'd have 50 if CAOA was a bill that was on the floor today. You would not have 50 Democratic votes. So it's a 60-vote reality. And I know that I see some of the comments in the box. I know people don't love to hear that, but I think that's unfortunately the reality.
And I think, quite frankly, one of the advantages of this conversation today is that we can perhaps start to get a strategy around really promoting the SAFE Act and looking at how we can really talk, David, to your point on the aspects of what that provides and the safety aspects of it and what communities will be better served if this, bill becomes a law. And I think one of the, it's optics are everything. And I think as an industry, of course, we want to have a broader, more comprehensive approach. However, the political reality to this world that we live in Washington is complex, difficult. And I think, quite frankly, we need to be somewhat comfortable with starting with the Safe Banking Act, having that as a success, and then leveraging that in the future, because we're competing with a lot of bigger issues. And if we're able to get this included into the NDAA, which is, there are discussions and it's moving forward possibly, I think that's a big victory. And we need to chalk that up as a victory and really promote that, and then begin on the next layer of lobbying and advocacy on the more comprehensive issues that are at hand.
I want to clarify something before we move on, because I don't want to paint the picture that we're all sitting around talking about banking in DC. If we could only work one issue at a time, we would all be out of jobs. So the very cornerstone of the work that I do is promoting equitable cannabis policy. And at the very core of that is ending prohibition. We never stopped that work. We submitted over 30 pages on the CAO Act. MCBA has, to use Cory Booker's language, we have laid ourselves down to stop legislation on the federal level from moving that would have pushed forward non-equitable cannabis reform through like a purely states' rights approach. So we never will stop working on ending prohibition. That is all of our mission. It is something that I know, the majority of us, at least definitely my organization, we are firmly committed to doing. MPP's been doing this for decades. So that the idea that we're going to not be promoting and working on equitable cannabis reform and ending prohibition because we're working on safe. In fact, I cannot wait to stop talking about banking so that I can just talk about other things a little bit more. And then to also touch on this idea that there is a choice between the two right now. And as Jared mentioned, there is the people who are going to vote for SAFE, and mind you, we need Republicans to do that. The Republicans that are going to vote for SAFE have already expressed that they are not the same Republicans who are going to vote for comprehensive, equitable cannabis reform. So I don't know whose votes we're losing. And if we don't have a path to comprehensive equitable reform, and I say comprehensive equitable reform because I think there is more of an appetite for a stripped down states' rights kind of an approach that doesn't include equity or criminal justice reform, then there is something that is equitable. But if we're pushing for equitable reform, the people who are going to vote for that are not necessarily the people who are going to, we lose a lot of people between that and SAFE. It's not an overlapping group of people. So the idea that we're choosing between the two is incorrect. And the timelines, we're talking about something that's going to happen years in advance and in the future. And so an incremental bill on a banking provision is not going to stop us from the incredible amount of work that we have to do. And as you will hear as we talk about the other bills, somebody had mentioned something I wanted to touch on really quickly is, will safe banking do anything to kind of end the discrimination in banking? No, I do believe there are provisions in safe banking that will provide us data to help us track that. We have some language we could potentially include in SAFE that would help kind of get some funding and protections for institutions that classically lend to people of color. But that is a conversation, the not lending to cannabis companies or minorities is a conversation we need to be having everywhere. Outside of this context, we need to be talking to cannabis investment firms. We need to be talking to all of the folks and having them re-examine what risk means and reassessing their lending practices when it comes to people of color. And we included a lot of that, and again, in our comments on CAO. So that is something holistically, as we are looking both at government funding and private funding, that we need to be aggressively re-examining.
Yeah, I think there's a really important point here. Looking at CAO, it was very interesting to see which topics they did cover and which topics were sort of not addressed in CAO. And it really shined a light on how much work is needed. There were all sorts of inadvertent consequences of the language in CAO that would have, for example, possibly decimated the medical cannabis industry while allowing for adult use. The FDA is probably the wrong organization to have regulatory or primary regulatory oversight over cannabis. There are a lot of folks in Washington who are really undereducated about how to properly regulate a cannabis industry, and there are all sorts of examples of cutting and pasting tobacco regulations or cutting and pasting pharma regulations and trying to make that work for cannabis. So the idea that we should hold off on incremental change, especially in an industry that has pushed incremental change for decades, right? In 1996, California passed Prop 215. We followed that with years and years and years of progress on medical cannabis. In 2012, Colorado and Washington passed adult use, and we followed that with lots of progress on adult use. Chris, maybe you can talk a little bit about incremental change in the cannabis industry and sort of how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, I know. As we were sitting here, I was thinking it's almost a cliche now at MPP of, where the perfect becomes the enemy of the good. And boy, doesn't that feel like we're there again with safe banking and the CAO Act and all the rest. I mean, it's been part of MPP's approach for a long time, and certainly it was well in place when I joined 8 years ago, that we sought change through incremental wins. You get to the next beach and then you fight from there. So this kind of all or none, if you don't, support this bill, then I'm not going to allow change in any other place, just simply goes against my DNA. I'm not a financial guy. I don't really care very much about banks, but I desperately want safe banking to pass because it shows momentum. It provides the needed help to those exactly the same businesses that Cory Booker claims he wants to help. He's hurting at the same time. It's incredible to me. And so I appreciate the frustration that I know others feel right now as we continue to push on this issue. I look forward to continuing the fight, and I hope that we follow Amber's lead, quite frankly, and get more bold out in the public with respect to where we are on these things, because I think we can forget ourselves sometimes. There's, Jared put his finger on it. What if we pass this thing as is? It wouldn't happen, but what if we did? Do you think Joe Biden is going to sign it? I don't know that he would. He hasn't really done us any favors. He hasn't delivered on what he said he was going to do. So we've got a long way to go here, and it's way too early in the game to start putting up our ultimatums and what we demand, because there isn't anybody in Washington rushing to deliver for the cannabis community right now. So I think safe banking is key. I saw a question that came up on the stream, and happy to at least start an answer to it, and that's, what can folks do? We're in an odd spot right now. If you look at who the senators are that are on our side, they don't line up with the states that are legalization states. Now, this is a ball that we have dropped, right? So this is an opportunity for the members, the folks that are on this call. If you have those opportunities to open lines of communication to members of the Senate, remind them who's in their backyard, right? Remind them who's paying taxes and making it happen in their communities, because we as an industry need to make that point clear. I don't think it's been clear up until now. So before we start, blazing new trails with senators in the Senate, let's make sure that those that are already in the bag are on our team. So that's my soapbox.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's talk for a second about safe banking and really what it would mean for cannabis companies, and what it wouldn't mean for cannabis companies, right? So I think there's a lot of confusion about what it does and doesn't do. Looking at it from my perspective, safe banking will be a benefit to almost every plant-touching cannabis business. There are companies that operate in the niche that has been created by lack of access to banking and other financial services that are going to have to take a long, hard look at their business model if safe banking passes. Some of those companies are taking a long, hard look now, and I would posit that if they're not, they should be. So if you're a provider of cashless payment transactions, right? What is the value of your service? How loyal are your customers when Visa and MasterCard are readily accepted at every retailer in the country? Any thoughts on safe banking and its specific effects, positive or negative, on cannabis companies?
I think positive one would be, one of the things that I think SAFE would eventually do, and it would not only be SAFE, but the implementing guidance that would come from it, because the law itself is pretty short and pretty broad, and regulators will fill in the blanks. So I think there was a question, well, do we still have to file SARs? Well, probably some, but not as many as you do now, right? And so the compliance costs, I think, associated with banking a cannabis business will go down. And presumably by virtue of that, the cost of banking would go down. So your fees that you'd have to pay every month, that kind of thing. I also think a part of what you would get with this is more banks would come into the ecosystem to begin with, because most banks are just saying, I'm not touching this. Like, I'm not dealing with this. I'm not paying this money. I don't want to deal with the scrutiny, despite the fact that this is a potentially highly lucrative business segment for my company, for my business, for my bank. I think a lot of banks will see that the green light is there. They will get into the business. And so now you can shop and you can actually go to different, you don't have to stick with that one bank that does this. I think that gives you the ability to work with other folks. I think the other piece is you have a financial ecosystem where banks are intermediaries. They're payment processors. There are other parts of the ecosystem that now I think you're having less, the compliance burden, I think, is going to be less onerous. And I think that alone, opens that, and just more players in the ecosystem, I think ultimately will introduce competition and choice, differentiation. People will want to do things to bank your business in ways that they don't. And so I think as an initial matter, it opens the floodgates, I think, so to speak. I still think there's some state issues where I think the banking across state lines, that's going to be the open question. I saw a question earlier about payments, and the payment rails are still interstate commerce, right? And so I think that's why we need, one of the things that does not require legislation is clarity from the Department of Justice so far as what that means. I think there's some tea leaf reading that we're all trying to do, and there's some lawyering in the comments around the Cole memo and so forth. I think some clarity from the DOJ around payments as well would be tremendously helpful for a lot of folks in the financial services ecosystem, which again, if SAFE Act becomes law, there's an impetus now for clarification across the federal government for what this means for regulated entities. So I think there's a ripple effect, obviously, this passed, and I think it's generally positive. I can't think of much in the way of negative externalities, with the exception of there are people, to your point, who are operating now in the void created by a lack of consistent banking service, and they'll have to compete. Their cost of capital and what that looks like for an operator is pretty significant. We're talking 20, 40%, interest rates, so to speak. Well, if you introduce banks to the equation and bank products for businesses, that cost of capital, because they have a lower cost of capital. I think that's, again, competition and access. That doesn't guarantee that a bank will make you a loan, right? I think you're still in that space. And I think that's where the state work is so important, because what we're seeing from states is some of their social equity provisions are creating these financing streams, which, again, far from perfect, but I think they're the right step. And also what you have in CAOA is also a reinvestment provision, which I think in a perfect world, and I think we're getting to build the cannabis industry we want to see. We want to see banking and traditional banking service, but also kind of equity-centered financing as well that can support these entities as well. So I don't see this again. I don't see choices. We need it all. Like, we need banking, we need grants, we need loans, we need public dollars, we need private money, we need all the money, in addition to all the justice, I think, efforts that we're talking about as well. So it's all of the above, and we don't have to make choices here.
I think some folks that are newer to the cannabis industry might not be familiar with just how disruptive the status quo with banking is. I've been in the cannabis industry since 2009. I've taught economics of cannabis at Amsterdam University for many years, and one of the things that I always have told my students is, if you have a cannabis business and you manage to get a bank account, whether or not you're plant touching, by the way, this is true of ancillary cannabis businesses as well, who are not violating the Controlled Substances Act. The second thing on your to-do list after you get a bank account, if you're lucky enough to get one, is to go and get a second bank account at an unaffiliated bank. Because for many cannabis businesses, it's not a question of if, but a question of when the bank will write you a letter and say, hey, we just realized you're a cannabis business. We're no longer going to provide banking services. You have anywhere from 24 hours to, if they're being generous, maybe 7 business days to remove all of your money from the bank. If you're a cannabis company that's relying on a bank account to pay your employees, to pay your bills, to pay your taxes, to receive payments from other companies, to receive payments from consumers, that can be a death blow. If you are struggling for a week or 2 or 3 or more to try to find a bank account because you've just lost access to yours. This is not a situation that other businesses face on a regular basis, and it is extremely common in the cannabis industry. The Arcview Group over the years has lost bank accounts. Many of our clients have lost bank accounts. I know individuals who have lost bank accounts because they work in the cannabis industry. So it really is a truly disruptive status quo that the cannabis industry is operating in. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the longer term picture, the idea of broader federal legalization. And one of the things that I think is of particular interest to the cannabis industry, and about which there is a huge amount of controversy within the cannabis industry, is the issue of interstate commerce and to what extent it will be allowed under a future legalization initiative. We have a really strange situation in the cannabis industry where every single state that has a legal cannabis market has an entirely siloed supply chain, where everything from cultivation to processing and manufacturing and retail sales, all of that has to happen within every single state that sells cannabis. This is not something that we see in other industries. It creates a lot of inefficiency. It also creates some opportunities that wouldn't exist otherwise, right? Like, in a world in which cannabis was treated like any other crop, you wouldn't see people growing cannabis in a state like Maine. You don't see people growing oranges or avocados in Maine, not because it would be impossible to do so, but because it's ridiculous. It's a little bit absurd to create the situation to do that. Any thoughts on the issue of interstate commerce and the discussions or lack thereof around that at the federal level?
Ooh, boy, that's a big one. I'll take the first swing at it, though. So the CAO Act was noticeably silent on the transition, which I think caused concern from a lot of folks, because if you don't allow for one, you really end up in a terrible situation. It's 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, where instead of the DEA coming after you, it's the FDA, and you're now just as illegal as you were the day before. It's just now a different agency. So clearly there has to be some kind of transition allowed for. The CAO Act didn't really articulate what that might be. There were a few hints here and there about how long agencies had to respond on different things, but that seemed to be more because language was borrowed from elsewhere than anything else. So, but then, okay, so that's one point, need to have something. At the same time, I find myself in many conversations in which it seems like groups are sort of arguing about their wish list. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, great. I'd like to see that too. I can think of things I'd like to see, but what are we going to get, and what is it realistic for us to actually ask for? And often the conversation sort of devolves into timelines, and how do we get to a timeline now if we can't even articulate what the regulatory system is going to look like? So there's a lot of scaffolding that actually has to go up, I think, before we're even going to get to that point where we can start to look at, okay, here's a timeline. What we can talk about is what we need to see in place before Interstate's in place. And I think that is very much worth a discussion. So I know at our organizations, we've been talking about them. I'm sure ICE Miller and MCBA have had similar discussions, and they probably sound very similar. But, if you take the approach that we've seen in the CAO Act, which is just sort of one day it's one system, the next it's another, that simply won't wash. We're going to have a transition period.
And this highlights one of the reasons why we have such a great opportunity with safe banking, because we have a largely uncontroversial bill within the cannabis industry. And that is rare. That is a rare thing. It's going to be very difficult to get all of the various stakeholders to come together on broader issues of legalization. I have no doubt that we will do it, but it's going to take some time and effort. So the opportunity to pass a bill that will almost universally be of benefit and that has really widespread support in the cannabis industry is a great thing. We have cannabis is one of the most popular. Cannabis reform is one of the most accepted issues in this country. We have 60% support for adult use legalization nationally. We have 90% support for medical cannabis legalization nationally. 90% support is not something that issues enjoy in general in the United States. 90% of Americans don't agree that evolution is a thing. So the idea that you have 90% of Americans who agree on anything, much less cannabis, is really indicative of, I think, where the conversation is going at sort of the dining room table. That has not yet trickled up to Congress, and even once it does, there are a lot of issues like interstate commerce that need to be carefully navigated, like social equity, that need to be figured out and sorted out before we get to legalization.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead, Amber.
Just to touch quickly on the interstate commerce issue, we have to strengthen the viability and try and create diverse state markets and help small businesses get healthy. There are a few approaches that were proposed, all the way from like suspend the dormant commerce clause, make it a really long runway. We sort of at MCBA landed somewhere different. We didn't want to arbitrarily make this process any longer, because as we see with hemp CBD, a protracted process to clarity around federal regulations is not good for small businesses. So really a lot of the work that we need to do to be transitioning, into a federal framework is going to begin on the state level. Number one, we need to pass safe banking. Number two, we really need to look at the captured markets and the normalization of protectionism within the cannabis industry, because if we don't start looking at the inconsistency between the policies that are being put forth and what people say they want in terms of a diverse industry, then we're going to end up really with 5 cannabis companies when we finally get to legalizing.
And I think, when we look at Interstate real quick, David, I think it's going to be the wild, wild west for a while. And that's something that I think we just need to understand and be, mindful of what the states are doing, because I think the states are a great test bed for a lot of different things that we can then leverage and think through what is that federal framework by which we're going to work from. And I think, it's one of those where there are a lot of similarities on the legislative front. I think there's a lot of generational views versus ideology. And I think when you look at Safe Banking Act and the passage of that, that will still be incredibly impactful and useful from a PR perspective. I think it will give people comfort in a way and acceptance of the industry, and will open the doors for further opportunities to have these deeper conversations about more of the details as we go forward.
Absolutely. And just before we jump into Q&A, I think that I mistakenly said that Moore had passed 5 times. I believe that that's Safe Banking that is on its fifth trip through the House. Moore has passed several times as well.
Thanks for that clarification, David. So I'm hopping on to do a few questions for the panelists that came through. I know a lot of them have been answered in the chat, so see if some of the answers are there. But for the group, the panelists, and feel free for anyone to take these, but how do you think Safe Banking will help offer compliant credit card processing for the industry?
Well, one, it should be more straightforward because you have to worry about less in the way of all the other things that are required now, namely. So yeah, I think the answer is it's a little bit more straightforward and more banks will participate than they do now. So I would say it would make it a little bit more straightforward for sure.
Yeah, it brings banking services, things like merchant services, closer to what they look like for any other industry. Now, banks will still have to be careful. They are still dealing with companies that are violating federal law. And if the companies are not being compliant with their state regulations, then there is some risk there for the banks. Banks will still be required to file suspicious activity reports for cannabis businesses the same way they would for any other business that they suspect of being in violation, but they would no longer have to file those suspicious activity reports simply because the business is a cannabis business, which is the situation that we have today.
Great, thank you. And what are the benefits and what could be the repercussions of rescheduling cannabis? And Chris, this is actually directed right at you, but I'm opening the floor as well. And it says additionally, what wouldn't that mean that pharmaceutical companies would also have access?
Well, they do now, right? I mean, we've already got the FDA's approved both CBD and THC for pharmaceutical use, and they defend it. So it would mean an extraordinary change in the way that we're doing things now. And I'm an advocate for thinking through carefully the regulatory framework that's necessary. If we don't, we end up in a situation similar to what happened with hemp, where it's just sort of a line item change where, we're just not going to include this in the CSA anymore without anything further. And what happens then, among other things, is it automatically falls into the FDA's jurisdiction, at least according to the FDA, it does. And now we're in a whole nother realm, right? Because now we're all producing substances intended for human consumption. So all of it is subject to FDA review at that point. And that's not a place I think really any of us want to be without some careful consideration first. So I think that before we remove ourselves from the list of controlled substances, we need to have a regulatory system we're ready to live with.
Yeah.
And rescheduling, I think, would be devastating. Descheduling is really the thing we have to push for here.
Yeah. I mean, as somebody who enjoys talking about regulations, especially FDA ones, to an extent that is probably unnatural. This has been a drum that I have been beating in cannabis for 4 or 5 years, that we have to have the tough conversations. The number one tough conversation that we have to have as an industry is when we legalize, because there is no precedent for a substance to exist outside of the drug approval process without giving something up to the exclusive purview of the pharmaceutical industry. So does that mean that we do not have isolated constituents? Does it, is it the form of the cannabis? Is it a concentration level? So it is important that we're going to look at, hey, if we want medical cannabis to exist, and there are frameworks, there's a framework for medical gases, there are frameworks for botanical drugs that can be worked. So if anybody tells you that it is impossible for us to create a framework for medical cannabis to exist on the federal level, they're lying. I mean, we have created new categories at FDA, and we have created new categories in other agencies to be regulated. So it just takes a lot of hard work. It takes thought, and it's going to take us coming together as an industry and agreeing what we are going to allow to be the purview of FDA. And for those of you who are saying, well, we don't want anything to be the purview of FDA, their primary mission, one of their primary missions is actually to support the development of pharmaceutical drugs. And so there is not a universe in which we will have medical cannabis without having a lane for pharmaceutical innovation of cannabis products. So that is the reality that we are working with. And as long as we can work within that framework and do the heavy lift, we can find a way for us to be able to still have medical cannabis on the federal level.
Absolutely. The FDA will have some role to play. I think it's in all of our best interests to very clearly define and limit the role that the FDA plays. They are an organization with a long track record of shenanigans when it comes to things like plant-based medicine. In fact, they're right at this very moment engaged in a campaign to try to create a new prohibited substance, kratom, which is another plant-based medicine coming out of Southeast Asia. The FDA has been trying in vain to get it prohibited in the United States for years, and they're now taking a new tack trying to get it prohibited through the World Health Organization. And we're seeing all sorts of the same kinds of reefer madness that we saw in the 1930s leading up to the prohibition of cannabis. So it's really disappointing to see, and highlights the fact that we really need to put a leash, so to speak, on what the FDA can and can't do when it comes to cannabis regulatory policy.
Great. Thank you for your input. Another one is, what opportunities are there for those of us in industry to comment or participate in the legislative process? What are the most effective avenues for engagement and influence?
Oh, no, go ahead, Tim.
No, just real brief. I kind of come from the Republican side of the aisle in my background working on the Hill. And, I've talked to a number of Republican offices, House and Senate, and their comments back to me, we need to hear more from industry, and they need to hear personal letters of the importance to business and their personal views from their constituents. And I know it sounds kind of, schoolhouse rock, but people need to hear on the basics of legislation and from a constituent and a personal perspective. And, we're into a lot of the details every day, and we just assume that members and staff hear from folks. I think there's a lot more that can and should be done, and working through the organizations on this call and others is truly critical, I believe, to our success with the Safe Banking Act and broader reforms in the future.
Absolutely. Both Marijuana Policy Project as well as Minority Cannabis Business Association put an unbelievable amount of effort into helping to create really good cannabis policy, and those organizations as well as others need the support of industry. We have a situation where the early days of cannabis legalization advocacy was funded in large part by philanthropists and social justice advocates. They did a fantastic job getting us where we are today, but many of them see an industry that has sprung up around this, and they're saying, why isn't the industry financing these efforts more heavily? We've done our part. We're going to step away and let the industry pick up the baton and run with it. And that doesn't work if the industry doesn't, right? If the industry doesn't really start to get behind the efforts to make good cannabis policy, we will end up with a situation where legalization will happen and none of us will like it.
That is a great point to end on. We're at the top of the hour. So I just want to thank Amber and David and Tim and Jared and Chris for your insights and for your time and just everything that you're doing for the industry to push this forward into the right direction. So I also want to thank the whole entire audience for tuning in today, and thank you for your engagement. There were a lot of great comments and questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions today. Make sure to look at MPP and MCBA to really help create actionable change. And at Arcview, we have a couple ways to engage further with this community. So one is our newly relaunched Arcview Access membership. And we also have our Women's Inclusion Network membership, where we hold bi-weekly interactive mentorship workshops. That was a tongue twister. And actually one is beginning shortly today. And the topic is Understanding Federal Cannabis Regulation, a View from Washington. So if you're a member of our Women's Inclusion Network, please join us today. And if you'd like information about the group, please check out www.arcviewgroup.com/win for more info. And for those interested in the New England cannabis market, we have a Massachusetts town hall this Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern, that you won't want to miss. And we will also be in Vegas. So if you are there for Cannabis Week, stop by our booth, C1824 at MJ BizCon. And we'll also just have a lot of Arcview folks around. So come stop and say hi. We also have our very own Gene Sullivan and David Abernathy speaking on panels during the event. So please make sure to also join us for the next Arcview Access on October 28th at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern, as we dig deeper into the opportunities in the psychedelic market. So thank you again, and we will see you next time, and have a great day. Bye, everyone.